Welcome back to the Dark Hours. Tonight I'm taking you deep into the frozen heart of Alaska, where ordinary lives crossed into impossible realities. These aren't just ghost stories. They're logs, journals, transmissions, and reports that were never meant for the public. And before we begin, I want you to do something for me. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. It helps me know who's brave enough to be awake with me at this hour, listening to stories you were never supposed to hear. My name is Caleb Morgan. I've worked as a telecom field engineer in Alaska for 9 years, climbing towers to maintain microwave links and cellular repeaters scattered across valleys where radios are the only thread to civilization. Most of my job is boring, tightening bolts, checking coax runs, and swapping out failed power supplies. But there's one site outside Talkeetna where nothing stays boring for long. The tower at mile 147 of the park's highway was built in 1998, a 140-foot lattice on a ridge that overlooks the Susitna River Basin. It relays both cellular voice and emergency services traffic. I've climbed it a dozen times since I started. Every time I came down with notes I couldn't put in the service ticket because no one would sign off on them. On April 12, 2022, dispatch logged a trouble ticket, noise on microwave backhaul, intermittent packet loss. That's routine. Alaska weather beats gear. I drove the 2.5 hours from Anchorage, reached the trailhead, snowshoed in a mile and a half, and started diagnostics. The shelter was powered, heaters running, no rodent chew on cables. But the log showed dozens of phantom calls queued in the emergency line, trunk. Numbers that didn't exist. Half of them were strings of zeros. Others were random 7-digit Alaska exchanges that hadn't been assigned since the 1990s. Each call lasted exactly 32 seconds, silent audio, then disconnected. I listened to one of the recordings. It wasn't silence. It was wind, but shaped, like voices buried under static. Cadence too regular for weather noise. One clip made my scalp prickle. A voice counting backward. 9, 8, 7, right down to 1. No accent. No breathing. Just numbers. The maintenance log before mine had a note from February. Phantom 911 calls, cleared after reset. I cleared the buffer and restarted the multiplexer. By the time I hiked back to the truck, another phantom call had logged time-stamped during my climb. 2 weeks later, a new ticket came in. Tech alarms, tower light out. That tower had LED beacons with 10-year lifespans. I packed my harness and went back. Mid-April wind cut through my jacket. I clipped in and began climbing. At 80 feet, my belt radio picked up chatter. Not dispatch, not crew channel. Analog hiss with bursts of voice that sounded like old VHF skip. Copy 2 meters. Then silence. Another burst. Stay. Line. Hold. The words were chopped like fragments of old search and rescue transmissions. I checked my handheld's display. It wasn't tuned to any frequency. I'd left it off scan. The speaker shouldn't have been making noise. I powered it off completely. The static continued, now coming from the fall arrest door speaker clipped to my harness. That device has no radio function. It just screams if your rope goes slack, yet it whispered, "You're too high." I nearly froze on the rung. Wind whipped. I focused on procedure. 3 points of contact, double-check lanyard, keep climbing. The beacon housing was intact. The LED driver board, however, looked wrong. The capacitors had been soldered with flux that wasn't ours, joints shiny and too perfect. A replacement, but not logged in any parts database. When I powered the circuit, the beacon lit, but instead of the steady FAA pattern, it pulsed in groups of 3, then 7, then 1, Morse-like. I recorded it on my phone, but later the file showed only a blank screen. No audio. By July, the site began pushing traffic when no one was using it. Usage graphs showed surges between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m. every night. Hundreds of megabytes transmitted downlink, but no record of what. IT traced it to our Talkeetna node. They called me again. I camped overnight in the shelter with a laptop connected to the backhaul. At 2:14, the racks hummed. LEDs flickered in patterns not consistent with traffic. My laptop displayed a stream of log entries with timestamps that made no sense. 3:27, 14:09, 22:44, all in the future. Packets decoded into plain text. ASCII. You climbed. You heard us. Will you answer? I pulled the Ethernet cable. The words kept scrolling on a screen that wasn't connected to anything. I needed something tangible. On my 4th trip, I set up a GoPro on time-lapse aimed at the beacon. I left it running overnight. When I retrieved the card, the footage showed the light flashing in its normal pattern until 2 a.m. Then, the camera froze. For 5 minutes, nothing. At 2:06, the feed resumed, but the beacon wasn't flashing at all. Instead, the tower itself seemed to glow. The lattice steel shimmered with faint white lines, like current arcing through invisible wires. Shadows of figures moved across the catwalk at 120 feet, figures that weren't there when I climbed. I showed the clip to a colleague. He said it looked like lens flare. I said lens flare doesn't walk. During a fall inspection in September, I found something wedged behind the shelter HVAC unit, a notebook sealed in a plastic bag. Its pages were stiff with cold. The first entry was dated 2007, signed by a tech named Dan Keeler. I didn't know him, but I looked him up later. He'd gone missing in a snowstorm that year after finishing a tower climb, presumed hypothermia. His last entries: beacon pulses not FAA standard, pattern matches prime numbers. Radio picks up voices when mast vibrates in wind. Climbed alone tonight, heard someone above me on rungs, no one there. If anyone finds this, don't answer when they call back. The final page was smeared with grease pencil symbols, crude triangles, and concentric circles. By February 2023, the tower was alarming almost nightly. Ops sent a crew from Anchorage. 3 men climbed, certified and competent. Only 2 came down. The third, a veteran named Harris, was last heard over radio saying, "Seeing someone above me." He never responded again. His harness line was intact, clipped to the rung. The lanyard ended at a carabiner that had been bent open sideways. Steel does not bend sideways by hand. Searchers combed the ridge. They found no body, no tracks in the snow leading away. His beacon continued to flash, but again in that 371 pattern. In May 2023, I volunteered, stupidly, to do a final audit. Part of me wanted closure, part of me wanted proof. I ascended slowly, talking every step aloud into my helmet mic to ground myself. At 100 feet, the tower began to vibrate, though there was no wind. My lanyard hummed like a guitar string. The higher I climbed, the more my headset filled with voices. They weren't shouting, they weren't even talking to me. They were murmuring coordinates, frequencies, dates, a language of technicians long gone. I recognized snippets: N, TS, B, accident numbers, incident codes from old trooper reports, lat longs that marked sites where people had died in avalanches, plane crashes, and storms. It was a roll call of the lost. At 140 feet where the beacon sat, my transceiver gave a single solid lock, like an avalanche search, showing 0.0 meters. That made no sense. These devices don't even operate on that frequency. I looked around. The air shimmered with pale outlines, like afterimages from staring at the sun. Figures clinging to rungs that weren't there. Some wore gear from the 90s, canvas harnesses and old Petzl helmets. One looked like Harris. They were all staring down at me. The beacon pulsed. 3, 7, 1. Then my headset cleared. A single voice, calm and mechanical. "Answer." I climbed down. I didn't even remember unclipping. I found myself at the base, kneeling in the snow with my gloves off, palms bleeding from holding steel too tight. The official log for that week says, tower inspection completed, lights serviced, site stable, no mention of Harris, no mention of the notebook, no mention of the phantom calls that still queue in the system buffer every night. I didn't file my audio recording. If you play it back, the climb sounds normal until about the 100-foot mark, then you hear dozens of voices layered together. If you slow the track, the voices separate. Some are men, some women, one, a child. They all repeat the same phrase. Stay on the line. Last month, a rookie crew was assigned to the tower. They called me for orientation. I told them to follow procedure, double clip, trust their equipment. I didn't tell them the truth, that some towers don't just relay our calls, they make their own. And if you ever hear one answer back with words it shouldn't know, don't answer, don't acknowledge, just climb down, because the moment you speak, you're on their line forever. My name is Eric Landon, and I spent 5 winters as a night shift operator at a remote fuel depot near Prudhoe Bay. Most people imagine oil work as big rigs and constant traffic, but the depot I was stationed at was more like a forgotten outpost, a couple of storage tanks. a shack with a radio, and a short airstrip that only saw supply planes twice a month. My job was simple: monitor tank pressures, log temperatures, and keep the heaters running so nothing froze solid. It was lonely, sure, but I thought loneliness was the worst thing I'd face out there. I was wrong. The first strange thing happened in January of 2021. At 2:12 in the morning, the pressure gauges in Tank 3 jumped by 30%. No pumps had kicked on, no valves were open. It was impossible. I walked the frozen catwalk, breath frosting in the air, and tapped the gauge. The needle didn't budge. I chalked it up to instrument drift and made a note in the log. But later, when I checked the backup recorders, the electronic sensors had matched the analog jump exactly, down to the second. That same week, the radio began picking up chatter. The company frequency is supposed to be dead silent unless dispatch and anchorage calls, but at 3:47, the speaker crackled with a calm voice reading coordinates. The numbers pointed to a stretch of tundra 15 miles south, empty, no infrastructure, no roads. I wrote it down and played back the recording, but there was nothing stored, just blank tape. By February, I started seeing things on the security monitors. The depot had 4 perimeter cameras, grainy black and white feeds that showed nothing but snowdrifts most nights. On the 18th, one of them froze mid-frame. I went outside to brush ice from the lens. When I checked the feed again, the frozen frame was different. Not snow, but a figure standing just inside the fence line, blurred, as if the lens couldn't quite resolve it. The other cameras showed nothing. I didn't sleep much after that. The depot had a logbook dating back years, and on a restless night I flipped through the old entries. Most were routine notes, wind directions, tank volumes, but scattered through the pages were sentences scribbled by different hands, all in the margins. Voices on 134.7 megahertz. Saw someone at the gate, vanished when I checked. Tank 3 pressure spike. Over and over, the same patterns. In March, Anchorage sent a relief operator named Dennis. I didn't tell him about the radio or the cameras. You don't dump your paranoia on someone who just got off the plane. But 3 nights in, he came into the shack, pale as chalk. "You running test tones?" he asked. I shook my head. He set the radio on the table. The speaker was hissing a steady tone, rising and falling like a siren. Only it wasn't constant. It had pauses, almost like Morse code. We recorded a few minutes. Later, when we compared it to a Morse chart, the message was chillingly clear. Open Tank 3. We didn't. On April 9th, Anchorage lost contact with us for 18 hours. Weather was clear, our antennas were fine, but every signal we sent out, voice or data, vanished into dead air. During that blackout, the depot felt different. The heaters ran quieter. The lights hummed louder. Dennis swore the shadows in the shack were moving against the bulbs. I started hearing a low vibration under the catwalk, as if something massive was shifting beneath the permafrost. The silence broke at 5:22. The radio erupted with every voice at once. Dispatchers, pilots, operators, dozens of channels layered together into a roar. Then a single clear phrase cut through. "You are temporary." The feed died, and Anchorage came back online like nothing had happened. In May, Tank 3's alarms tripped again. This time the overpressure release hissed in the still night, venting vapor. I climbed up, flashlight beam slicing the cold, and saw condensation on the steel that hadn't come from inside. Ice crystals formed words where the vapor struck the frozen wall. "Stay." Dennis quit 2 days later. He packed his duffel, caught the next supply plane, and never came back. That left me alone for the last 6 weeks of my rotation. The final incident happened June 14th. I just finished logging midnight readings when the monitors flickered. All 4 cameras showed the same image, the depot seen from above, as if from a plane hovering directly overhead. The tanks were outlined in white light, and around them stood dozens of figures. Not men in parkas, but shapes too tall, too thin, their heads turning upward toward the camera. Toward me. I yanked the power from the monitors. The shack went dark except for my headlamp. The hum under the floor grew louder, a bass thrum I could feel in my teeth. The radio clicked on by itself. A familiar calm voice said, "You should not stay." Then silence. At dawn, a supply plane buzzed in early, unscheduled. The pilot told me Anchorage had ordered an immediate rotation, no reason given. I didn't argue. When I returned 6 months later for a routine audit, the depot was gone, not shut down, not dismantled, Gone. The tanks, the shack, the catwalk. Everything had been scraped away as if it had never existed. The ground where it once stood was flat tundra, snow blowing across unmarked ice. The logbooks, my recordings, even the foundation bolts, nothing remained. But I kept one thing. A scrap of paper torn from the margin of the old log, folded deep in my coat pocket. In a faint pencil scrawl, barely legible, it reads, "Tank 3 is not for fuel. Don't open." I still dream about the vibration under my feet, the feeling that the depot was never built to store anything for us, but to contain something the ice itself didn't want freed. And when I wake, I check the radio beside my bed. Most nights it's silent, but sometimes, at exactly 3:47, it hisses once, pauses, and whispers coordinates to places I pray I'll never see. My name is Aaron Whitfield, and for 12 years I worked as a winter ranger at Wrangell St. Elias National Park. My job was mostly paperwork and patrol, checking cabins, monitoring trails, and making sure snowmobilers didn't wander into avalanche zones. You learn quickly in Alaska that the wilderness doesn't care if you're prepared or not. If you make a mistake out here, the land will correct it, and nobody might ever find you. But there's one patrol from January 2020 I can't file away as weather or bad luck, because no amount of training explains what I saw on the Katina Glacier. It began with a distress ping from an avalanche beacon. Our monitoring station picked it up at 2:19 on January 17th. The signal was strong and consistent, broadcasting the universal SOS code. The problem was the coordinates. The beacon was coming from a section of the glacier that had been closed since 2004 after a massive collapse tore open a mile-long crevasse. We'd posted signs, blocked routes, and logged it as impassable. Nobody should have been there. I set out with another ranger, Maria. The snow was hard-packed under the skids of our snowmobiles, the night lit by a fractured moon. We followed the GPS until the signal grew loud in our receivers, then parked near the glacier's edge. The beacon pulses were sharp, clean. Whoever had triggered it was less than 500 meters away. We hiked in with avalanche probes and ropes, moving slow across the ice. The signal drew us toward the mouth of a crevasse wider than a 2-lane road. The beacon registered just inside. I swept my transceiver, expecting to see a name or ID number, but the screen displayed only zeros. Beacons always carry registration codes. This one was blank. Maria leaned over the edge with her headlamp. "Do you see that?" she asked. 50 feet down, the ice walls glittered, not blue but faintly green, like phosphorescence in deep ocean water. The beacon chirped steady, urging us closer. We rigged lines and descended. The air grew colder the deeper we went, heavy with a smell like old stone. The walls of the crevasse were not smooth, but ridged with patterns, parallel grooves that looked deliberate, almost carved. At the base, the signal was deafening. But there was no injured climber, no gear, no beacon in sight. The ice underfoot was strangely clear, like glass. Beneath it lay something dark, elongated, maybe 30 feet long. I thought it was rock until Maria tapped her probe against the ice and the shape shifted just slightly, as if disturbed by the sound. We both froze. The beacon chirped once more, then stopped. Our receivers went silent. We should have climbed out right then, but Maria wanted evidence. She snapped photos, but her camera froze on a single frame, the dark shape under the ice. Every time she tried to take another shot, the same image burned onto the screen. Then the sound began, a low vibration rising from the glacier itself. Not wind, not cracking ice, but a hum that resonated in our teeth and bones. I felt my chest tighten, my vision blur. Maria staggered back and clutched her helmet. "It's saying something," she whispered. I shook her, told her it was just vibration, but she insisted it was words. We hauled ourselves out as fast as we could, our radios hissing with static. At the surface, the beacon signal returned, only now it wasn't an SOS. It pulsed out numbers, long strings that scrolled across my receiver. Latitude, longitude, altitudes. Coordinates across Alaska. Some familiar, some in areas marked as no-go zones. The final string matched the exact location of our ranger station. When we returned, Maria filed a partial report but left out the details about the sound. I followed her lead. You don't keep your badge in this line of work if you start writing about talking glaciers. But it didn't end there. 2 nights later, the beacon signal came back. This time, from a valley 30 miles away, another ranger went to check it. He found nothing but ice and wind, but when he returned, his avalanche receiver wouldn't shut off. It kept chirping coordinates, the same set Maria and I had heard, until the battery finally died. By February, the park had logged 5 separate beacon incidents, all in restricted or dangerous zones. Each time, the rangers found no one. Each time, the signal shifted afterward to a new site. And each time, the coordinates added up to something like a map. I stopped sleeping properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the grooves in the ice, repeating endlessly like written lines in a notebook. Maria wasn't doing better. She told me she'd started hearing the hum in her cabin, faint, beneath the sound of the heater. She swore it followed her even when she left the station. On March 3rd, she vanished. Her snowmobile was found parked neatly near the glacier. Her line was anchored to a piton, rope trailing down into the same crevasse where we'd first heard the hum. We pulled her gear up, helmet, gloves, harness, but not her. The rope was cut clean, as though severed by a blade, not frayed against ice. The official report called it an accident, a slip, a fall, unrecoverable, but the rest of us knew better. The rope had been cut from below. A week later, I returned alone. I shouldn't have, but I needed answers. The beacon was silent, but the crevasse glowed faintly, even without moonlight. I rappelled down, boots crunching against frozen ridges. At the bottom, I pressed my hand to the ice over the dark shape. The hum started instantly. This time I heard the words too. Not in English, not in any language I knew, but in my head. Concepts instead of syllables. They showed me movement under ice, stretching for miles, bodies stored like veins in a frozen heart. They told me the beacons were not tools, but invitations, signals to bring us down to listen, to join. I yanked my hand back, breath fogging the air, but the hum didn't stop. It rose, louder and louder, until the ice beneath me fractured. A long crack spread across the chamber. Water surged upward, freezing as it touched air, sealing the fissure almost as quickly as it opened. In that brief glimpse, I saw an eye staring back. It wasn't human. I clawed my way up the rope, slipped twice, arms burning, certain something was following. When I reached the surface, the beacon on my harness activated by itself, broadcasting steady pulses. I tore the battery free, but the pulses continued in my receiver for 10 full minutes after. I quit that spring, turned in my badge, moved south, told myself I'd seen enough of Alaska for one lifetime. But every now and then I check avalanche reports online, and lately there are patterns that don't make sense. Beacon pings, logged by automated monitoring stations at times when no one's on the ice. Always 32 seconds long. Always followed by coordinates that lead to places already marked as unsafe. Sometimes, late at night, I take out the receiver I kept. Its screen is cracked, the battery long dead, but every so often the display flickers back to life on its own. And when it does, it shows the same location again and again. My current address. I haven't told anyone else. Because I know what it means. Whatever is under the glacier doesn't want rescue, it wants witnesses. And once you've heard its signal, you carry the beacon for it whether you want to or not. My name is Daniel Cross, and for 3 years I worked as a caretaker at an old Cold War radar station outside of Kotzebue. Most people don't even realize how many of those stations still exist, rows of steel domes and antennas built in the 1950s to watch for Soviet bombers. When the military left, some were stripped for scrap, others abandoned to the snow. A handful, like the one I managed, were sold off to private companies that used them for research. At least that was the cover story they gave us caretakers. The facility where I lived was called Site Echo 9. It sat on a ridge 30 miles from town, surrounded by nothing but tundra and empty sky. The company said they were using the radar domes to study ionospheric activity. My job was to keep the generators running, check the fuel tanks, and make sure vandals didn't strip copper from the place. Simple work, decent pay, and quiet. Too quiet. The first winter went normal. A few weird glitches, sure, monitors showing ghost echoes, screens filled with static bursts. I wrote them off as atmospheric noise. But in December of the second year, something changed. The radar logs began recording returns at impossible altitudes. Not planes, not satellites, things moving above the atmosphere, too slow for meteors, too fast for balloons. The blips appeared at exactly 3:12 every morning, stayed on the scope for 7 minutes, then vanished. I didn't report it right away. You learn quick in isolation jobs not to sound paranoid. But curiosity got the better of me, and I started printing the logs. Each night's trace was almost identical, like something was following a pattern. By January, the pattern grew stranger. The objects weren't just moving, they were arranging themselves. Triangles, lines, a circle that held steady for 5 minutes over the station before dissolving. I thought about UFOs, of course. Anyone would, but then came the sound. On January 29th, the main dome filled with a low-frequency vibration. At first, I thought it was the generator, but when I cut the power, the hum didn't stop. It came through the floor, through the steel beams, through my chest cavity like a second heartbeat. I climbed into the dome and felt the air pressing against my ears, like standing under deep water. On the scope, the shapes pulsed in sync with the vibration. I recorded it with my handheld, played it back later. Nothing but static. In February, the company sent 2 technicians. They stayed for 48 hours, ran diagnostics, and told me nothing, but before leaving, one of them pulled me aside. "If you hear it again," he said quietly, "don't answer." I asked him what he meant. He just shook his head and walked out to the chopper. 2 nights later, the vibration came back, stronger. The radar domes shook like drums, and then, layered within the hum, I heard words. Not in English, not any language I knew. But the meaning landed anyway, like it was being injected straight into my head. Identify yourself. I froze. My radio popped with static even though it was turned off. The scope printed a pattern that looked eerily like letters. My own name, jagged across the thermal paper. Cross. I didn't sleep that night. By March, the station began to behave like it had its own agenda. Doors I locked were found open. The backup generator kicked on even when the main one was fine. The cameras in the supply hall showed shadows moving against the light, long shapes that didn't match human forms. And always, at 3:12, the radar would light up with impossible tracks. One night I decided to test it. Instead of ignoring the hum, I keyed the station's transmitter and spoke. "This is Site Echo 9. Identify yourselves." The response was immediate. Every light in the dome flared white. The scope traced hundreds of returns, blotting the paper until it was solid black. The vibration drilled into my bones until I felt my teeth ache. Then, through the static, I heard my voice. My own words, repeated back to me but twisted. Longer, distorted, as if something was trying to learn how I spoke. The last word wasn't mine. It was new. It said, "Stay." I should have left. I should have packed my gear and called the company, but I stayed, like it told me. And the station punished me for it. In April, the log printers began running without paper. Blank pages came out covered in faint impressions, like invisible ink pressed by heavy hands. When I held them under heat, images formed, schematics for machines I didn't recognize, star charts that didn't match the night sky. One page showed a diagram of a human body with sections crossed out, as if they were unneeded parts. By May, I wasn't alone anymore. I saw them first in the reflection of the dome glass. Figures, tall and angular, moving just outside the building. No footsteps in the snow, no heat signatures on the cameras. But when the vibration rolled through, the shadows bent like reeds in wind. One night I woke to the sound of boots on the metal stairs. I thought it was another technician. When I opened the door, the stairwell was empty, but the snow on the landing had melted into footprints that weren't shaped like boots. On June 3rd, the station's beacon activated by itself and broadcast for 20 minutes on an emergency frequency. Anchorage Tower logged the call. A pilot on approach swore he heard a voice repeating coordinates and the word cross. But the transmission equipment was disconnected. I had pulled the fuses days before. That's when I knew the station didn't need me anymore. It could speak on its own. The company evacuated me a week later under the excuse of seasonal staff rotation. I didn't argue. When the chopper lifted off, I looked down at the domes one last time. The radar dish inside wasn't pointing skyward anymore. It had tilted, slowly, deliberately, to follow the helicopter. The official report lists Echo 9 as decommissioned. Satellite photos show nothing but concrete pads where the domes once stood, as if they'd been dismantled and hauled away. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And some nights, at exactly 3:12, my home radio bursts into life, hissing with the same vibration that shook the domes. When it does, I don't answer, because I know now what that technician meant. You only get one chance to refuse. and I already gave the station my name. My name is Marcus Hale, and until last winter I worked with Alaska Search and Rescue out of Fairbanks. We get called for everything: lost hikers, snowmobilers who run out of fuel, hunters who don't come back. Most of the time it's exposure, sometimes an avalanche, once in a while a body under ice. But in November of 2022, we got called for something that none of our training manuals prepared us for. The call came from a group of geology students out of Anchorage. They had been mapping permafrost layers near the Yukon River, 20 miles east of Circle. Their guide, a local bushman named Eric Lewis, had failed to return to camp after a routine survey walk. According to the students, he radioed once, said he had found something wrong with the ground, and then silence. They gave coordinates and begged for help. We flew in the next morning, me, 2 other SAR techs, and a pilot named Rob. We sat down on a flat stretch near the river. The students looked rattled but safe. They swore they hadn't gone looking for Eric because the area gave them the creeps. One girl said the snow sounded hollow when she tried to follow his tracks. We started the search at first light. Eric's boot prints were easy to follow, straight line into the trees, no sign of panic. About half a mile in, we found his radio lying in the snow. The casing was cracked, as if dropped, but still powered. The last transmission had been recorded. Eric's voice, low and strained. Ground's moving. Hollow underneath. Don't. Then static. We pressed on. The boot prints led us to a depression in the snow about 20 feet wide. At first I thought it was an old sinkhole covered by ice. The tracks ended right at the edge. The snow was sagging inward, flexing like stretched fabric. When I tapped it with my probe, the ground shivered. That was the moment I realized the students hadn't been exaggerating. The earth here wasn't solid. We set anchors and sent a camera probe down through a drilled hole. The feed showed a vast cavern beneath us, 40 feet down. The floor was ice, but not natural. The surface was scored with lines. Perfectly straight grooves, intersecting in geometric patterns, too precise for geology. Then the feed cut. Not static, just black. We argued about next steps. Protocol said to mark the location and call in specialists. But Eric's boot prints ended right here, and I wasn't about to fly home without at least trying. Against my better judgment, I volunteered to rappel down. The descent was smooth. My boots hit ice that felt thicker than any frozen lake I'd ever walked on. The cavern stretched into darkness, my headlamp barely touching the walls. But what made my skin crawl wasn't the size. It was the sound. A deep resonance thrummed through the chamber, almost like an engine idling far underground. I walked carefully, radioing updates. The grooves carved in the ice formed repeating symbols, shapes that reminded me of runes or circuitry. Some were glowing faintly blue, pulsing in rhythm with the vibration. When I knelt to touch one, the ice was warm. I found Eric's backpack about 30 yards in. Inside was a core sampler and a notebook. His handwriting was shaky, rushed, not natural. Listening posts, they're everywhere under the permafrost. The last line trailed off into scratches. Then I saw the footprints, not Eric's. These were longer, narrower, pressed deep into the ice like something heavy had walked barefoot. They led from the far wall straight toward where I stood, then stopped. No return trail, just ended. My radio hissed. For a moment I thought it was command, but then I recognized the voice. It was Eric, but it wasn't live. It was the same broken transmission, looping over and over. Ground's moving, hollow underneath. Don't. Each repeat grew more distorted until the words were unrecognizable, just guttural sounds forcing their way through the speaker. I called for extraction, but the rope above me jerked hard before the others could respond. My line went slack. I looked up just in time to see the mouth of the shaft folding shut, not collapsing, but sealing, like lips pressed together. The last slice of daylight vanished. Panic set in. I sprinted toward the wall, hammering at the ice with my probe. Cracks spidered outward, but beneath the surface wasn't more ice. It was something metallic, humming with current. My headlamp flickered. The grooves around me lit up. Brighter now, symbols dancing as if alive. From the darkness came movement. Slow, deliberate. I swung the beam and caught a glimpse of something rising from the ice itself. Its body faceted like crystal, its limbs too many and too thin. It didn't walk. It unfolded. The footprints I'd seen weren't from walking. They were from emerging. I backed away, radio screaming static in my ear. Then, for one clear moment, a voice, not Eric's, not human, cut through. "You are inside." I ran blind until I found the rope dangling useless against smooth ice. It hadn't been cut. It had been pushed through the closing surface like thread through fabric. I grabbed and pulled, but it slid free with no anchor. The next memory I have is waking in the snow outside, the others shaking me. They said the ground split open under me and they hauled me up before it sealed again. But I know that isn't what happened. There was no hauling, no rescue. I walked out somehow, though I don't remember climbing. Eric was never found. The depression filled with hard ice overnight, erasing all trace of the shaft. We marked the GPS and flew out. Official report says, probable crevasse accident, body unrecoverable. But I still have Eric's notebook. I keep it in a locked drawer, though sometimes I swear I hear it humming faintly, like the cavern itself. The words inside shift when I look at them too long. Letters bending into new forms. Pages warmer than paper, has any right to be. And last week, when I turned on my personal radio at home, it clicked to life at 3:12 a.m. The same time Eric vanished. The same loop played. Grounds moving. Hollow underneath. Don't. Only this time, it didn't cut to static. This time, the voice said my name. I haven't told command. I haven't told my wife. But I know what it means. The ground out there isn't dead. It's listening. Waiting. And sometimes it opens. Not to swallow you whole, but to let something out. My name is Nate Kincaid, and for 11 years I've been a signal maintainer on the Alaska Railroad, based out of Wasilla. I take care of everything that tells a train whether to stop or keep going. Track circuits, crossing predictors, relay cabinets, signal masts, the works. My days are math and mud. You trust currents measured in milliamps, and voices that come out of boxes buried in snow. Steel talks, if you know how to listen. On January 9, 2024, the gates at milepost 173.4 came down at 2:13 in the morning for a train that didn't exist. The dispatcher out of Anchorage called me after 3. She said her CAD screen lit up with an occupancy between two signals in dark territory. No track circuits there, just axle counters. A grade crossing had gone active for 7 minutes. No trains were scheduled, no warrants issued, no crew calling signals on the road channel. She told me it was probably moose and that I should take a look when daylight came. I drove out before sunrise, headlights cutting through fog that crusted the snow in pale yellow. The cabinets were warm with battery heat. Inside the predictor, the event log showed everything by the book. Advance warning time, 28.3 seconds. Island occupied 6 minutes, track clear. Exactly what you'd expect for an honest-to-God train. The approach circuit had calculated a perfect warning time, as if wheels were sliding steel to steel down the rails. Moose can drag a balance, sure, but they don't give you a repeatable approach, time down to the 10th of a second. I ran my checks anyway. Battery float, 13.6 volts. Shunt sensitivity nominal. Island lit when I shorted the rails with a shovel, dropped when I lifted. Everything performed. I chalked it up to frost and drove home. The next night at 2:13 sharp, the gates dropped again. Event log nearly identical, off by 3 seconds. The third night, again. 2:13:22. Same duration, same shunt, same clear. That kind of consistency doesn't come from animals. It comes from schedules. We've got AEI readers along the line, gray cabinets with Yagi antennas that sniff ERFID tags as freight cars pass. There's one at milepost 171.9, not far from that crossing. It reports to a Wabtec server downtown. I asked IT to pull the overnight reads. The email came back with a CSV attached. Timestamp, 2:12:51. Red count, 179. Tags, zeros. An entire consist of zeroed EPCS is not a thing. AEI tags can be dead, but not all of them, not at once. The file still smelled like a train. On the fourth night, I parked by the crossing with a thermos of coffee gone stale. I tuned my handheld to the defect detector downline at MP 165. The bells fired right on time. Gates came down smooth, road lights strobing red across nothing. I leaned out the window and put 2 fingers on the rail. It hummed. Not loud, not strong, but undeniable. The long, far-off vibration of wheels in steel. 2 minutes later, the defect detector came alive over the radio. Detector, milepost 165.1, no defects. Total axles, 179. Temperature minus 15 degrees Celsius. Detector out. No crew answered, no horn on the wind, just my rail singing until the gates lifted. I wrote it up as an equipment issue. That's what you do, because there are only so many boxes you can tick before you get laughed out of a safety meeting. But the dispatcher called me anyway. "We just logged a movement authority that auto-canceled," she said. "Train ID 0, speed 0, location." She trailed off. "It's giving me 2 mileposts at once." She asked if I was hearing anything. I lied and said no. On January 14th, I brought a scope meter. I clamped across the predictor feed and watched the waveform shift, clean as a textbook. That's how a predictor knows when to drop gates. It senses the change as a long steel object approaches. The math isn't magic. The scope showed a train in the math. But there was nothing on the rail except snow. 2 nights later, the crossing at 173.4 wasn't the only one. Gates dropped in sequence 3 miles north at 176.5 and south at 170.2, like a smooth, rolling wave of islands tripping in order. The defect detector called more axles now. 286, then 314. A consist that grows as it rolls is not a consist. At 176.5, the old impact printer inside the bungalow coughed out paper with a list of times, axle counts, and reporting marks. NPGNMILW. My grandfather used to tell me stories about seeing Milwaukee Road electrics north of here before the line died. I stared at those 4 letters too long. I dragged a roadmaster out one night, old school guy, skeptical of anything not in a manual. I told him the story, showed him the logs. He muttered about frozen joints and moose. We parked our trucks on either side of 173.4, headlights off, radios quiet. At 2:13, the bells fired, the arms dropped, our dashboards flickered like magnets rolled across. I looked down the line, straight, empty, nothing but snow shining dull under starlight. Nothing to see. Nothing to see. And then I saw the air ripple, as if heat rose in waves. The railhead gleamed with a moving band, like the ghost of a headlight sweeping past, and the wind pressed forward in a long, slow wave as though displaced by a string of cars. The roadmaster spat in the snow and said without looking at me, "Don't talk to me." Later that week, dispatch screens began generating movement authority revocations for train ID 0000. The system even showed an engineer acknowledgement, the button press you'd expect from a crew in the cab. There were no crews. I asked for a screenshot. The top read 214, with my crossing listed as restriction lifted at 220. I didn't sleep. Daylight inspections made everything look normal. Predictors tuned, bonds tight, joints intact, batteries full. I tightened a lug that wasn't loose. I cleaned leaves out of a case that had no leaves. I told myself I'd imagined it. But the old roadmaster told me a story in a tone I recognized, the way old hands say things they believe but won't put in writing. South of Fairbanks, searchlight stayed green for a train that never showed. They said it got stuck for a wreck that never cleared. Rails, remember, not with rust, with current. On January 20th, the AEI reader chattered again. This time the list wasn't zeros. It had letters, some current, some retired, some from companies that haven't run cars in half a century. I folded the paper and slipped it into my pocket, trying not to think about which museum wall might hold those same plates. A hotbox detector downline reported a hot bearing on axle 114. Right side, right side. No crew answered. A section gang found a puddle of blistered grease beside a joint bar like something overheated there, and left. No flange marks on the rail. By February, locals started calling the public number posted on our crossing signs, complaining the gates were dropping for phantom freights. One maintainer filmed it. Bell clanging, arms down, snow falling undisturbed under the gate. Social media chalked it up to wind. The wind doesn't make a predictor calculate textbook warning times. One night I put a quarter on the railhead south of the crossing. If a wheel flanges over it, it'll press it flat. 7 minutes after the gates dropped, I checked. The coin was gone. 30 feet down, it lay crushed and bent into a shape no hand could bend. Not smeared clean like a wheel's ribbing, but mangled into something halfway between metal and memory. That was proof enough. The official incident tickets say we replaced a predictor card at 173.4 on February 15th. They say we tightened bonds, cleared ballast, recalibrated the AEI reader. All true. They don't mention that the bell at 176.5 rang in prime numbers, 9 strokes, then 11, then 13. On my last night before taking rotation home, the dispatcher's voice came thin and brittle. "We're getting a test tone through the back office," she said. "It's asking for you. Your maintainer ID." She laughed once, flat as paper. Cab keyed it. I drove out and parked with the heater whining. The aurora stretched a green sheet across the sky. At 2:13 the gates dropped. My dash clock jumped an hour backward, then forward. The rail hummed. The air above the ballast warmed against my palm. Then came the sound. Not a horn. Horns have breath. This had current. A long, controlled call that made my ribs buzz. Behind it, faint voices spoke in cadence. "Approach medium. Restricting." Old signal aspects we don't even use anymore. In my truck's side window I saw it, a conical flare of a headlight bright enough to leave star lines, but the lines radiated from nowhere, at an angle the world didn't have. I left, walking slow across the ballast, careful not to twist an ankle. I didn't run. Running meant you believed it could catch you. Spring rotted the snow and the crossings calmed. The AEI readers went quiet, detectors scolded real crews again. Everything went back to behaving. But sometimes, driving past 173.4, I tune the back office channel. There's a heartbeat on it now, a faint tick, counting 9, then 11, then 13. My wife says I tap my finger in my sleep, 4 beats, a pause, 4 beats, like a crossing bell stuck in my skull. Old heads will tell you blocks don't always clear. Some signals never reset. I believe them now. Because the moment you acknowledge a train that isn't there, you've given it right of way through your head. And it always runs on time. My name is Elena Ruiz. I've been an avalanche forecaster with the Chugach National Forest Avalanche Information Center for 12 winters and a volunteer operations lead for Alaska Mountain Rescue since 2014. I teach beacon classes in parking lots at Turnagain Pass. I've written too many obituaries for skiers I used to see at the trailhead, and I can usually tell you if a slope will fail by looking at wind texture on the skin track. I trust instruments, and I trust snow science because they've kept me alive. On March 3rd, 2024, at 1712 Alaska time, my avalanche transceiver locked onto a burial signal at 457 kilohertz from a person I could see standing 3 feet to my left. It was a Wednesday. We'd had 33 centimeters of low-density new snow over a weak layer we'd been tracking since mid-February, a faceted crust about 60 centimeters down that was waking up under the latest loading. The morning advisory warned of touchy wind slabs on 35 to 40 degree leeward terrain and remote triggering possible. Standard language when the snowpack is a layer cake. At 15:38, we received an in-reach SOS relayed to troopers and then to our dispatch. Avalanche, 2 buried. Turnagain Pass near Sunburst Ridge, coordinates 60.8232, negative 149.1619. The message stream showed 3 bursts in a minute, then silence. Troopers spun a helicopter. We rolled 2 sled teams and a 6-person probe group out of the Turnagain lot. Air conditions turned marginal. Didn't matter. We could get there faster on sleds. The first odd thing was the in-reach track. The SOS pinged a new coordinate at 1541 that moved upslope, slowly, against gravity. The device reported 3 meters per second uphill for 47 seconds, then stopped just below a cornice line that didn't exist on any of our morning photos. Troopers asked if the device could have fallen and been dragged by slow. Maybe, but the track angle was too clean. It moved like a person walking uphill. No one walks uphill under a debris apron. We broke trail in increasing spindrift. Wind out of the north was shaving the surface into chalky waves. At 16:29, Team 2 radioed a collapse in a test slope on a 37-degree rollover, extended column test propagating, ECTP, on the first 10 taps, Q1 shear at 58 centimeters on the February crust. I logged it and kept moving. We hit the debris fan at 16:51, classic dry slab, crown about 1.5 meters tall, 200 meters wide, ran 300 vertical into low-angle trees. The bed surface glittered with new facets forming in the cold air. 4 of us switched transceivers to search. My Barry Vox S came alive with the familiar heartbeat beeps and a direction arrow jumping between 32 and 34 meters. 2 other rescuers called distances, 37, 35. We spread to bracketing distances with probes ready. Wind hissed. I could hear my own breath in the foam of my mouthpiece. That's when my unit added a second icon. 2 victims. 34 meters and 3 meters. Copy 2, I said. Negative, Aaron replied. One signal only. Same, said Kat. Single. My screen showed a strong nearby source at 3 meters with that solid arrow lock you get when you're almost on top of a burial. I looked up. The only 3-meter target was Aaron, standing there frowning at his own device. Keying rescue send? I asked. If a transceiver senses movement, some models switch out of search to send for self-protection. Maybe his had kicked. He held it up. Search mode, Elena. Solid. I swept mine across him. The signal ticked to 2 meters and the arrow rigidly pointed at his chest. I could feel the tremor in my hands as I toggled my unit off and back on. When it rebooted into search, the 3-meter target blinked out. The 34-meter target remained. We pushed up the bed surface, following the longer arrow, doing the figure 8 when the directional got confused by terrain. At 17:09, we reached the first burial point, marked an X, and began probing. The beep cadence accelerated as the Berry Vox switched to fine search. Finally, a strike. Firmness of a pack, not rock. The probe vibrated with that sickening, unmistakable contact. Strike at 190, Kat shouted. We dug like wild animals. We excavated a cavity shaped like a person, not a body, a negative. The space was exactly human-sized, trenches at shoulders where straps would have laid, a helmet-shaped bowl at the head, indentations at hips and boots, all lined with fresh depth horror, sugar snow, glittering with a rime glaze like the inside of a freezer. There were tiny, perfect facets grown on every surface, as if the air itself had invested time sculpting the void where heat once was. My glove touched the inside and the crystals squealed, a dry squeak that made my teeth hurt. There was no one inside, no gear, no heat signature, nothing. Check slope for surface clues, I said. My voice sounded steady, my chest did not feel steady. We spread. I tried to keep the process going because procedure is a rope. Mark, probe, dig, clear. You don't let go of the rope because your brain is telling you a story it doesn't understand. At 17:12, my transceiver doubled again, 2 victims, 38 meters and 1 meter. Confirm? I asked. The others read off their screens, single signals only. The 1-meter arrow didn't point at any obvious snow. It pointed sideways, straight through the gap between my outstretched arms, and settled on the center of my chest. The Berry Vox beeped fast enough for a fine search. Distance read 0.9 meters. The live view of cat's claw wind texture on my jacket looked back at me. I switched to send. The target disappeared. We found 2 more cavities within the next 30 minutes. Each was a human mold lined with fresh facets, perfect, recent. One was so crisp we could see the tiny velvet pattern from a balaclava imprinted in ice. We never found bodies. We never found skis or poles. The only gear recovered that day were 3 shredded backpack straps and a ripped glove cuff wedged under a block of debris. No blood. No evidence of trauma besides the avalanche itself. Troopers arrived on the second wave when winds dropped enough for a hop. The pilot radioed he didn't like what he saw. Cornices we hadn't photographed that morning, and small sloughs running uphill into cross-loaded ribs. He put the ship down on safe, low angle, and sent his Reco operator out with the helicopter detector, big aluminum paddle on a stick, loud in headsets when it hits a reflector. The Reco was noisy everywhere, false positives from rocks, from debris, fine. But the operator kept getting strong returns in an organized line marching upslope, exactly like pings from multiple reflectors buried at regular intervals. We flagged the line and followed. It led us to a 4th cavity, then continued into the start zone and vanished under the unwelcome weight of our own boot packs. We stood by our probe lines as the wind hardened spindrift into glass. The sun panned sideways and everything went blue. Troopers asked about the inReach. We checked the margin. No device, no strap imprint, no bright orange case in the runout. The last ping had been under a cornice 30 meters headwall side of the cavities. The cornice itself hummed with wind in a way I could feel through my teeth. We concluded at 2040 for the night and staggered to sleds with our headlamps punching holes in the spindrift. I was last onto mine. Before I pulled my hood up, I switched my transceiver to search and panned it one last time across the empty slope. 1 signal. Distance. 19 meters, direction arrow locked. I rotated. The arrow followed my rotation and pointed at our own sled, then at me when I faced forward again. I switched to send and didn't look back. The official incident report is public. 2 missing backcountry skiers presumed deceased in an avalanche near Sunburst Ridge on March 3, 2024. Extensive search efforts recovered no remains. Weather impeded air operations. The advisory the next morning referenced anomalous wind loading and inconsistent reactivity of the persistent weak layer. It did not mention cavities. My report to our director included those. I logged depths, dimensions, bed surface temps, humidity, photos with a steel meter for scale. I sent the Reco operator's GPS track of his reflector line. I attached a printout from my transceiver's rescue log, some models' record searches. In that log, the 1712 self-lock showed up as target proximity 0.9 meters, ID 02. That's not a thing most people know about modern beacons. Their signals are anonymous, but some have a secondary channel, W-link, that can transmit additional data like motion detected or vital data probable. Most backcountry users never touch it. My Barryvox S tags each detected signal with a session ID so you can mark and move on. My 0.9 meter lock was ID 02. That same ID tag appeared 3 more times over the next week. Not on the mountain. In my truck. On March 6th, I drove through Turnagain in clear afternoon light. I didn't intend to stop. I pulled off at the lot because I found my hand touching the transceiver pocket on my bibs. I powered it into search out of a dumb private need to check something I knew I shouldn't need to check. 3 signals. 37 meters, upslope, 16 meters, across the lot, 1 meter, in the cab, ID 02. I powered the unit off. I took the batteries out. The little screen faded to nothing. I sat still long enough to hear the heater tick and the wind rock the truck. I still heard it. Not the tone from the transceiver, the cadence. Beep, beep, beep. If you've used one enough, you hear that tempo in your sleep. My fingers shook as I jammed the batteries back in. The screen didn't lie. With no power, my unit couldn't read anything. Did not matter. There was a rhythm at the edge of hearing anyway, not a sound exactly, more like a pulse, a sense. I put the truck in drive and didn't stop until the road bent toward the inlet. We returned to the site daily while weather allowed. On March 7th, a storm loaded everything with 50 more centimeters and spooked the pilot. We stayed low, worked the fan, and found 2 new things. First, the cavities had grown facets thicker than should have been possible in 48 hours, as if a persistent temperature gradient had been engineered inside those hollows. The crystals were textbook depth Hoare, cup-shaped, large, perfect, grown, where heat moved from warm ground toward cold air. But these formed on the cavity walls in the middle of the debris, aligned like they'd grown around the outline of a human who'd remained there to radiate heat into the snow. Second, we found an old probe flag 30 centimeters below new snow, ribbon frayed, metal shaft corroded to dull gray. The tag was stamped with an incident number I recognized. We'd lost a snowboarder to a deep persistent slab in 2018 not far from here. The red flag had been part of that grid. Someone had pushed it into a burial then. Now it was in the debris of an entirely different slide, drawn into this one by gravity or by something else. We asked the family's permission to tell the public we'd found cavities so people would understand how dangerous the layer was. They asked us not to. No remains is hard enough. Human-shaped hollows in ice is something you think about at 3 in the morning for the rest of your life. The official notice stayed clinical. I tried to go back to normal work. Forecasts, pit profiles, community presentations in gymnasiums with paper coffee cups and projector hum. At a beacon practice session in the Girdwood lot, I buried 3 training beacons and set students to find them. When they switched to search, half the units in the class read multiple and locked onto a 4th signal that wasn't in the ground. One student, soft-spoken, serious, walked a clean grid and stopped 5 feet in front of me. He stared at my jacket and said, "It says you're at 1 meter." I told him to check his mode. He flipped his unit to send, then back to search. The arrow moved from me to the white slope of Alaskan and held at 33 meters. The boy's lips moved, counting the beeps under his breath like a prayer. I sat alone in our office that night and listened to the case recordings, trooper helo traffic, our sled teams back and forth, wind noise, static, the occasional clipped gallows humor that sneaks into hard days. I heard something back from the wind I didn't tell anyone. On the Reco channel, our operator flooded his headset by waving the detector too close to the helicopter's skid. The rescue tone screamed for a half-second in his mic, a high, urgent chirp with a specific timing we all know. The slope answered, Not the detector, the mountain. The answer came faint through someone else's mic. Cats, I think, as a matching chirp a fraction of a second later. Same cadence, same pitch, but arriving like an echo from a throat that shouldn't echo. I took a day off and drove to Hatcher Pass to sit on a different snowpack. In the Willow lot, two snow machiners in bibs were arguing about how their beacons kept seeing ghosts on the ridge. That was the word one of them used. Ghosts. He laughed while he said it, like a joke you make small so it doesn't make you big. I don't have a good ending. We never recovered bodies. In April, when the spring heat rotted the pack and everything moved like soup, the cavities collapsed with the debris. The inReach never pinged again. The cornice fell on a day I was home doing taxes. That slope will fill and flush and fill again with winter after winter and bury new people who think they're smarter than gravity. But I can tell you what happened 2 weeks later in our gear room. I keep my transceiver in a mesh bag, batteries removed, to avoid corrosion. I also keep, against protocol and common sense, the ripped glove cuff we found in the debris. It should have gone to evidence. It did not. Some part of me couldn't let it go. It sits in the bottom of a bin with old demo beacons and retired probe tips. At 2:37 on March 19th, the building alarm tripped. Motion in the gear room. I drove over because I live 15 minutes away, and because I didn't want a janitor to be the person who opened that door. The lights were off. The exit sign hummed. The smell of wax and wet nylon and stale coffee lived in the air. I stood in the doorway and waited until my eyes adjusted. Beep. Slow. Calm. Near. I did not have a transceiver on me. I did, out of reflex, still my breathing to hear the cadence clearly. It came from the mesh bag, from the bin with the glove cuff. I pulled the bin down. Somewhere in that mess, with no batteries, something chirped. The slow mechanical comfort of a practice beacon calling for help in a parking lot. My hands shook. I pawed through webbing and plastic and aluminum. The chirp repeated. When I dug deeper, my fingers found the cuff. Frost rhymed its torn edge. The chirp came again, close, intimate, as if it were tucked into the knit. I held the cuff to my ear like a child and closed my eyes. The sound moved through my skull into the brittle place where practical people store fear. It wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. It beat exactly like a beacon in send. It beat like a heart. I put the cuff back and drove to the inlet. I sat on a pullout and watched black water breathe under a sky that didn't care. The tide sucked at the ice with noises that made me think of the facets squealing in the hollows I shouldn't have touched. I promised myself, like a person bargaining with a god, that I would say nothing more. I went home and slept with my transceiver on the nightstand set to off with the batteries out. At 3:14, I woke to the rhythm anyway. If you drive over the pass at night with your radio on scan, sometimes you'll catch it. A faint metronome that isn't on a channel, not a tone, not exactly, more like the sense of an instrument doing its job even when no one is holding it. If you switch your beacon to search just to prove to yourself there's nothing there, the arrow might find you. It might point at your chest and tell you you're buried under 1 meter of something you can't shovel out of. We teach a simple thing in rescue classes: be faster than the snow. You have 15 minutes before asphyxiation becomes statistics. We back that with numbers from studies and timers in parking lots while friends shout encouragement and the winter sun makes shiny lies of everything. I still believe in those numbers. I still carry a probe and a shovel in my truck. I still tell strangers to change their batteries in December. The rope of procedure has kept me alive. But there is a second rope, I think, running under the ice and wind up there. If you lay your ear to certain slopes on certain days after certain storms, you can hear it plucked by something that remembers shapes and wants them back. The mountain learned our language, the tidy cadence that says, "A person is here." Now it answers. And when it calls, some part of you that loves clean lines and cold air wants to answer too. If you've made it this far into the darkness with me, you're the kind of person who doesn't flinch when the shadows move. Do me a favor, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss the next night we go wandering where we shouldn't. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always interesting to see who else is awake while the rest of the world sleeps.